Nobody at Detroit Metropolitan Airport expected Chris Hemsworth's response that overcast afternoon. The terminal bustled in the usual way. Families quarreled excited children. Business travelers typed furiously on their phones as they lined up for coffee, and busy staff in neatly pressed uniforms directed passengers to gates. A steel, gray sky pressed low over the runways, casting the interior of the airport in a muted light. Pale sunshine broke through the large glass windows here and there, creating odd patches of brightness on the tiled floor. This was the standard scene in a busy American airport on a weekday, with travelers weaving through one another's paths, some eager to begin a vacation, others rushing home for urgent matters, still others preoccupied with the myriad reasons that push people into flight. Chris Hemsworth, unannounced and unassuming in a simple gray hoodie and dark jeans, blended with the general throng more than one might think. Even at 6'3", with a figure that many recognized from the big screen, he didn't command immediate attention. Perhaps it was the day's subdued mood, the thick clouds outside, or simply the nature of airports as great equalizers. Everyone was there for a reason, each traveler selfless, focused, stressed, excited, or anxious. But Hemsworth was here for a quick trip related to a promotional campaign for an upcoming film. A well-known philanthropic group had invited him for a short appearance in Detroit, a city he had never fully explored. He'd been ushered through security like anyone else, graciously deflecting the occasional starstruck glance. Most travelers darted past without even noticing who he was. He reached the main concourse and took a moment to orient himself. The airport staff had told him to look for gate C29 if he wanted to grab a quick flight to Los Angeles that evening. He had a short gap in his schedule, enough time to breathe, eat, and maybe walk around to stretch his legs. The overhead announcements echoed, flights delayed, flights boarding, families being paged to find a missing member. No one had time to truly look at the tall figure with the kind face scanning the signage. Yet something about the day felt heavy, as though the entire building quietly held its breath. Standing to the side of the walkway, Chris noticed a passenger not too far away. He was a young man, no older than his mid-20s, wearing a light sweater despite the moderate chill from the overcast weather. He had dark circles under his eyes and seemed to be fighting some internal battle of nerves. On a leash beside him stood a medium-sized golden retriever wearing a vest that read, "Service dog. Do not pet." The dog's large, gentle eyes looked up at the man with unwavering devotion. Occasionally, the dog pressed its muzzle into the man's leg, as if offering reassurance. Chris had seen service dogs often. He respected the vital role they played for people with disabilities that weren't always obvious. And something about this dog, about the man's haunted expression, caught his attention. He did not approach them right away. Instead, he watched. Airports were pressure cookers, especially for people with anxiety. The tension of schedules, crowds, overhead announcements, and the feeling of being herded through lines can be overwhelming. The traveler rubbed the back of his neck, his posture stiff, scanning the overhead monitors. It was possible that the presence of the dog, a source of comfort, was crucial to his mental well-being. Hemsworth breathed out softly, a pang of empty stirring inside him. He recalled times on set when panic or stress threatened to derail a day's shoot. Despite his image as a calm action hero, he'd wrestled with anxiety in his early career. A sense of not measuring up, a fear of letting people down. Over the years, he'd learned coping strategies, but for some people, therapy animals were that vital anchor. The crowd thickened in waves. At one point, an airline representative took the microphone at the podium by gate C30 and started calling out something about seat reassignments. A queue formed. Chris planned to walk to the small cafe near the gates to get an Americano. But an off note in the atmosphere stopped him. It began subtly with a murmur, then the uncomfortable shift of people's attention. The young traveler with the service dog had approached the gate agent. Chris only heard fragments from a distance, I checked your policy. I need my dog helps with my anxiety. You can't discriminate. The gate agent stiffened as though personally affronted. A second staffer emerged from behind the podium, a stern-faced supervisor with a name badge glinting under the ceiling lights. Hemsworth moved closer. In crowded terminals, there were always raised voices, missed flights, lost luggage, seat confusion. He wasn't one to meddle. However, something about the supervisor's tone set his teeth on edge. It was clipped, dismissive. You need the right paperwork, she snapped. Emotional support is not the same as a service dog. Our records indicate you haven't provided appropriate certification. The traveler's voice quivered. He's not just emotional support. He's trained for anxiety episodes. He's a service dog as defined by the ADA. I made sure to bring everything. I have a letter from my psychiatrist, his training documents. But the supervisor cut him off. We have regulations. We'll decide if it meets the standard. And from the look of it, I don't think so. Passengers at the gate began to stare. The golden retriever stood quietly, occasionally leaning against the young man's leg, sensing his rising distress. The man looked around, and Chris could see the flush on his face. Part embarrassment, part desperation. People parted in the traveler's path. Some wore sympathetic expressions, while others looked on with curiosity or annoyance. The airport staff's voice rang out, as though wanting to attract attention, as if humiliating the traveler might cause him to back down. Hemsworth had encountered controversies regarding the distinction between service animals and emotional support pets. He understood that airlines had policies to ensure passengers' safety and comfort. But the essential question was this man legitimately using a trained service dog for a psychiatric condition? If so, the Americans with Disabilities Act usually protected him. Something about the staff's aggression, however, suggested they simply intended to refuse him, with or without cause. Chris took a step forward. He could not stand idle while someone in need was being bullied, especially someone who had done everything he could to comply with regulations. By now, a small circle of spectators had formed. The supervisor raised her voice, arms crossed. The traveler clutched a folder of paperwork, shaking slightly. I have everything you asked for, he pleaded. It's here. Please look at it. That was the moment Hemsworth decided to intervene. He closed the distance, mindful not to overshadow the young man, but determined to offer support. Excuse me, he said in a measured voice. The supervisor turned, her face betraying a flash of recognition that quickly shifted into confusion. Yes, she realized who he was. The onlookers recognized him too. Whispers rippled through the gathering crowd. But Chris spoke calmly, wanting to keep the focus on the real issue. I couldn't help overhearing. The gentleman said he has a legitimate service dog. He's offering the paperwork. Would you mind clarifying the policy for him? It wasn't an accusatory question, but the supervisor stiffened. For a split second, she looked as though she might swallow her anger because a high-profile celebrity was standing there. Then, perhaps out of a sense of wounded pride at being publicly challenged, she doubled down. Sir, this is none of your concern. We have procedures here and he hasn't complied. Chris's gaze shifted to the traveler, whose eyes now darted anxiously to the circle of onlookers, as though the situation itself was triggering precisely the anxiety he was trying to manage. The golden retriever pressed closer. Chris gently placed a hand on the traveler's shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie rather than pity. It's all right, mate, he murmured. Then, to the supervisor, I'm sure the airline has a policy that aligns with federal law. If he's indeed providing the documents, I'd expect you could at least review them carefully. A security officer, older, stoic, started walking over, perhaps alerted by the elevated voices. The uniform and the official stance should have symbolized help and order. But in that moment, the traveler looked almost more distressed. How many times had he encountered disbelief, scorn, or intimidation from authority figures when it came to his invisible disability. The supervisor and the security officer exchanged glances. The security officer's voice emerged low and firm. "Is there a problem?" The supervisor exhaled. "He's insisting on boarding with an unverified dog. It's an operational risk." The traveler tried again, voice trembling. "He's not unverified. Please, just look." He opened the folder, papers shaking in his grip. "I've got his service dog credentials, the letter from my doctor. He's trained to detect panic attacks and help ground me." Hemsworth carefully took a half step back, letting the traveler speak for himself, but he remained at his side, and the tension rose. The security officer's posture suggested he might forcibly remove the dog, or possibly the passenger, if this didn't go the staff's way. Several bystanders lifted their phones, capturing the confrontation on video. Some travelers asked each other in hushed tones what was going on. Chris felt his heartbeat accelerate, but he steadied himself. This wasn't about taking over the traveler's fight. It was about ensuring the traveler had a fair chance. "Officer," Chris said quietly, "could you please look at his paperwork?" The older man's brows knitted. He took the documents, scanning them briefly, but then shook his head. "We have to verify this with our internal guidelines. It could take time. He might have to wait for another flight." "That's not fair," the traveler said, voice taut with dismay. "I checked your website. I followed the rules. I submitted everything online before. Nobody said there was a problem until now. My father just had surgery. I need to get home." It all spiraled from there. The supervisor insisted they had the right to refuse. The traveler pleaded that he had complied with all official procedures. The dog, as if sensing its owner's rising panic, nudged him repeatedly and then sat to block him from moving further into the swirling conflict. The traveler's hands shook so intensely that the folder almost slipped to the floor. Chris cast a helpless look around, noticing that even more people were filming now. Had it been a straightforward matter of checking credentials, it would have been resolved in minutes. But the supervisor seemed obstinate, even resentful, that Chris Hemsworth was interfering and a crowd had formed. An older woman stepped forward, an airline passenger, her voice trembling with indignation. "That's not right. If the gentleman has all the documents, you should honor them. You can't just turn him away because you feel like it." The supervisor lifted her chin. "Mom! I need you to step back and let us do our job." A swirl of conflicting energies filled that portion of the concourse. People parted and reformed, some whispering that this was discrimination, others uneasy because they feared missing flights. A father tried to usher his daughter away from the scene. A business traveler tried to slip past to the front desk, but the tension around the gate was too thick. The security officer turned to the traveler and said in a low voicer, "Perhaps it's best if you come with me and we sort this out somewhere private." That was all it took for the traveler to nearly break down. His dog nudged him incessantly, trying to redirect him from a panic attack. He was exhausted, likely short on time, and the confrontation itself was fueling the very anxiety that the dog was trained to mitigate. He looked around as if seeking an escape. Chris saw his eyes brimming with frustrated tears. In that moment, Chris Hemsworth gently took the traveler's elbow, guiding him away from the immediate path of the crowd. "All right," he said. "Let's see if we can solve this calmly. We'll go somewhere quieter." He gave the security officer a measured look. "I'll accompany him, if that's all right." The security officer hesitated but nodded, even he seemed slightly intimidated by the entire fiasco going viral. After all, Chris Hemsworth was an international celebrity. A cluster of phones was still pointed in their direction, capturing every breath. The supervisor, apparently unsatisfied, marched behind them. The group, Chris, the traveler, the dog, the security officer, and the supervisor, moved away from gate C30 to a small, glass-walled side office. The onlookers parted, letting them pass. People mumbled that it was shameful what the traveler was facing. In the quiet of the side office, the traveler slumped into a chair, tears threatening to overwhelm him. The golden retriever put its head on his lap. Chris crouched beside him, voice soft. "You okay?" The young man nodded shakily, though it was clear he was trying to stave off a wave of panic. His voice quivered. "I'm sorry you didn't have to get involved. It's just I did everything by the book. I've flown with him before. I never had a problem until now." Chris squeezed his shoulder gently. "No apologies. You have every right to stand up for yourself." Then he addressed the security officer, who hovered near the door. "Look, is there a more straightforward process to verify his documents? We can contact the airline service desk or someone from management with the authority to override any misunderstanding." At first, the supervisor standing behind the security officer scoffed. "We've told him. We have to go through our procedures. He's not the first to claim a dog as a service animal. A lot of people try to sneak pets on board. That's why we're strict." While Chris understood concerns about abuse of service animal rules, the traveler's documents were in order. Anyone who took the time to read them could see that. "You keep saying that, but have you read them thoroughly?" he asked. The supervisor's jaw tightened. She flipped through the paperwork, scanning it in a perfunctory way. "I'll forward this to our legal department." The traveler bit his lip. "That could take days. I only have a short window to get home." He blinked away tears. "My dad's in the hospital." But the golden retriever shifted, resting its muzzle on the traveler's thigh and staring up at him. Chris recognized that silent communication, the dog's unwavering devotion. A swirl of conflicting emotions rose in Chris: frustration at the callousness of the staff, empathy for the traveler's predicament, and a sense that this went beyond mere rule confusion. He'd known airline guidelines typically recognized service dogs for physical and psychiatric disabilities alike. The problem here was that the staff seemed determined to assert power rather than find a solution. Chris inhaled, then said, "Let's contact the airline's main help desk or a manager who can sort this out quickly. Please." He kept his voice civil but firm. "If there's any question about the validity of the documents, it's best to get an official ruling from the highest authority available." As tension simmered, the security officer nodded. "I'll radio my superior," he said quietly, stepping out. The supervisor huffed but didn't leave the room. She tried to appear in control. Meanwhile, Chris stayed by the traveler. A few minutes ticked by in uncomfortable silence. The traveler's eyes darted between the dog and the closed door, as though bracing for more trouble. Occasionally, Chris offered a small comment. "We'll sort this out." Or, "I'm right here." Simple reassurances to keep the man anchored. When the security officer returned, he brought with him a tall, middle-aged man in a crisp suit. A regional manager for the airline, he had the air of someone used to problem-solving in high-pressure situations. He introduced himself with a polite nod, ignoring the scowl from the supervisor. "I'm told there's a conflict regarding a passenger's service dog," he said. "Let me see the paperwork." He took the folder, and for a few minutes, the only sound was the quiet hum of the overhead lighting and the rustle of pages. The man's brow furrowed as he read, occasionally glancing at the traveler, the dog, and Chris. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I see no issue here," he said. "All the documents are legitimate and up to date. This dog is indeed trained as a service animal. According to the guidelines, he has every right to board." But the traveler's tense posture softened in relief. Chris nodded, feeling a weight lift. The manager's voice took on an apologetic tone as he turned to the traveler. "I'm sorry for the trouble. You should be allowed to board as planned. Let me expedite the check-in process for you." A small, grateful smile flickered across the traveler's face. He rested a hand on his dog's head. "Thank you," he said, voice unsteady with lingering emotion. "I really appreciate it." And then the manager turned to the supervisor, his gaze quietly reproachful. "I'll need you to note in the system that Mr. Andrews and his dog are cleared for travel. If there's any internal policy question, it can be addressed after, but there's no reason for further delay." The supervisor's face flushed, but she nodded, swallowing whatever retort she might have had. The security officer also gave a curt nod, stepping aside. One could feel the tension in the room start to recede, replaced by a mix of awkwardness and the traveler's immense relief. Chris reached out to pat the traveler's shoulder. "All good now." "Mate," the traveler nodded, tears of relief pooling at the corners of his eyes. The dog leaned up to nudge the traveler's cheek, sensing a shift from distress to gratitude. The manager politely offered to escort them back to the gate, ensuring everything proceeded smoothly. But as the small group left the side office, they were greeted by a surprising sight. A cluster of passengers still stood, phones in hand, waiting to see the outcome. A ripple of applause broke out as the traveler emerged with his golden retriever. They'd watched the confrontation, recognized the injustice, and now they were cheering for the outcome. For the traveler, for Chris Hemsworth stepping in, for a small but meaningful victory over discrimination. The traveler's cheeks reddened, unused to being the center of attention. Chris, though used to public scrutiny, still found it heartwarming and humbling. "Thank you," the traveler murmured to the crowd, overwhelmed. The dog panted happily at his side. People parted to let them through. Chris walked beside them, quietly ensuring that the traveler got to the check-in podium. The manager spoke a few words to the gate agent, then motioned for the traveler to proceed. The supervisor, thoroughly chastened, lingered at the back of the area, trying to keep her composure. Some passengers shot her disapproving looks. Meanwhile, the traveler turned to Chris, extended a shaky hand, and said, "I can't thank you enough. I didn't know what else to do. You saved me. I need to get home to see my dad, and this dog is my lifeline for the anxiety. I really appreciate you stepping in." Chris shook his hand gently. "Happy to help. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm glad we got it sorted out." The dog seemed to grin at him too, tail wagging. It might have ended there, with the traveler boarding the plane and Chris heading on his way, content in the knowledge that justice prevailed. But the seeds of a bigger change had been planted in that confrontation. Dozens of passengers had recorded the incident on their phones, start to finish. Some had even done quick live streams to social media. By the time Chris Hemsworth grabbed a coffee at a nearby kiosk, he was beginning to see pings on his own social feeds. People he barely knew were tagging him in posts. The footage was there, the young traveler trembling, the dog calmly trying to soothe him, the supervisor's scornful refusal, Chris's intervention, the final resolution. It had all been captured from multiple angles. In an era where viral videos often sparked national debates, this was a powder keg. Issues surrounding disability rights, especially invisible disabilities, were often misunderstood. The question of how airlines treated psychiatric service dogs was a subject of long-standing controversy. Seeing a major star quietly but forcefully stand up for a young man had an immediate emotional impact. By the time Chris finished his coffee, the first local news outlet had picked up the story. He scrolled on his phone, sipping the warm Americano. Headlines popped up. Chris Hemsworth stands up for passenger with service dog at a Detroit airport. Celebrity confronts airline over alleged discrimination. The videos were embedded. Comments poured in from viewers praising Hemsworth's calm approach and condemning the staff's discriminatory actions. Others questioned the authenticity of the dog. Though the traveler's documents had been verified, some online commentators clung to skepticism. Heated debates flared in comment sections. Airlines have to be strict. Wes, but that was clearly discrimination. The guy had all his paperwork. The staff was out of line. We need better training for employees to handle service dogs. Chris felt a surge of concern and empathy for him. The matter was settled. He hadn't meant to go viral. He only wanted to do the right thing. Yet now the traveler's face, the dog's pictures, even Chris's own presence were front and center in an online storm. They had unwittingly become the rallying point of a bigger conversation about airline policies, disability rights, and compassion in public spaces. He finished his coffee and decided to wait at the gate until the young traveler boarded his flight. When Chris arrived, gate agents were cheerfully welcoming passengers. Some recognized him and offered a polite smile or a grateful nod, as though acknowledging the day's drama. The traveler was seated near the front of the boarding area, the dog curled at his feet, quietly exuding calm. He looked up, a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety in his eyes. Chris walked over, gently tapping the traveler's shoulder to get his attention. Mind if I sit? Of course not, the traveler said. I think we might still have a few minutes before they start boarding. Chris nodded, lowering himself into the seat. I saw some of the footage. People are paying attention. The traveler let out a shaky breath. I just wanted to get home. I never wanted to make a scene, but part of me is strangely glad this is getting attention. Maybe it'll force them to improve training. You know, it's not the first time I've had trouble with staff who don't believe my disability is real. Chris studied the dog, who gazed back with patient eyes. He's a beautiful companion, he said, reaching out to let the dog sniff his hand before giving a gentle pat on the head. I hope it brings you some comfort that people are speaking up. Sometimes it takes a public outcry to spark change. They chatted quietly about how the traveler had been dealing with anxiety since childhood, how therapy and medication helped but weren't enough in certain situations, and how the dog had changed his life, alerting him to oncoming panic attacks, providing grounding pressure when he felt out of control, and giving him the confidence to travel alone. Chris listened with genuine interest. He reflected on his own experiences coping with performance anxiety early in his career, though it wasn't the same magnitude. That sense of being trapped by fear was universal in a way. Soon, an announcement came. We'll begin boarding Flight 572 to Phoenix in just a few minutes. The traveler gathered his belongings, a small carry-on in the folder of documents still clutched in his hand. He gave Chris a shy smile. Thank you again. I really can't say it enough. Chris rose, returning the smile. Take care. All right. And good luck with your dad's recovery. They shook hands. Then the travelers stepped into the priority boarding line, dog trotting obediently at his side. Chris watched them go, feeling a mix of relief and lingering frustration that this had happened in the first place. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a local reporter hurrying in his direction, microphone in hand, camera operator close behind. Word spread fast. Chris sighed inwardly, acknowledging that this story had momentum now. The reporter, a young woman with short dark hair, breathless. Mr. Hemsworth, do you have a moment? I'm from Channel 4 News. We saw the videos circulating online, and we'd love a quick comment. Chris glanced toward the gate. The traveler was already out of sight, now safely on the jet bridge. Sure, he said, trying to keep it brief. On camera, the reporter asked. Can you tell us what happened earlier? Chris explained in a few concise sentences that he witnessed a passenger with a legitimate service dog facing resistance from staff, that the passenger had all the documentation required by law, and that fortunately a manager stepped in. I'm just glad it worked out, he finished. My hope is that airlines and airports continue to train staff properly, so this kind of misunderstanding doesn't happen. People with invisible disabilities deserve respect and compassion. The reporter nodded, eyes shining with appreciation for the quote. Thank you, Mr. Hemsworth. Do you think there's a larger issue with how public institutions treat those with psychiatric service animals? Chris paused. I'm not an expert, but from what I've seen, it's not an isolated incident. The rules are complex, and staff aren't always trained to interpret them. It's vital that we remember these individuals rely on service animals for medical reasons. We have to be careful not to discriminate. With that, he gently excused himself, wanting to avoid turning a single moment of decency into a prolonged media spectacle. But as he walked away, he knew the wheels had already been set in motion. The incident was bigger than the passenger, bigger than him. The social media outcry was immediate, and as the hours passed, more mainstream news outlets picked up the story. Hashtags about service dog discrimination trended. Disability advocates chimed in, praising Chris's intervention and condemning the airport staff's actions. Others shared their own horror stories of traveling with service animals. By the time Chris boarded his own flight to Los Angeles a few hours later, his phone was flooded with messages from his publicist, friends, and random supporters praising what he had done or asking for more details. Part of him worried about the traveler. Did he want this attention? Or would it be too overwhelming? But he told himself that the manager's involvement had resolved the immediate problem. The bigger wave that was building might lead to something positive, like new training or policy reviews. A day later, the story had escalated further. Major entertainment websites and news channels ran segments featuring the confrontation video. Disability rights organizations contacted Hemsworth's team, expressing gratitude and inviting him to speak about the importance of service dogs for people with psychiatric conditions. The airline in question issued a carefully worded statement promising to investigate the staff's actions and re-examine their training protocols. The statements used typical corporate language about ensuring all passengers receive the highest level of service and respect. There was little mention of how they would address the specific wrongdoing or the supervisor's attitude. However, the outcry was loud enough that they couldn't ignore the problem. They promised a more comprehensive review of airport policies. A few days later, Chris found himself in Los Angeles, stepping off an elevator into a modern glass-walled conference room at his agency's headquarters. His agent, a composed woman in her 40s, greeted him with a wry smile. I don't know if you intended to become the new face of airline policy reform, but that's what's happening, she said, motioning him to a seat. Chris shrugged. I just saw someone being treated unfairly. I couldn't stand by and watch. She nodded, opening a laptop. Well, it's blown up. A handful of nonprofits focusing on disability rights want to partner with you for awareness campaigns. The airline wants to meet to discuss a public demonstration of improved staff training. Meanwhile, the passenger, Kyle Andrews, has given a couple of interviews. He's praising you, but also talking about how this is a widespread issue. Chris shifted in his seat, thoughtful. It's good that he's speaking out. If it helps others avoid that same discrimination, it's worth it. His agent agreed, pointing to the screen where a news article was open. The headline read, Traveler with service dog speaks out. Chris Hemsworth's intervention was a blessing. The piece went on to describe Kyle's history of debilitating anxiety, how his dog, Samson, had been pivotal in helping him regain independence. It also quoted Kyle talking about the humiliations he'd faced when people didn't believe his disability. Most of the time, they assume I'm lying or I just want to bring my pet. Kyle was quoted as saying, but this is literally my lifeline. Reading those words, Chris felt a surge of warmth and sadness combined. He could only imagine how many others had gone through something similar without a celebrity by their side, and without it going viral on social media. What do you want to do? His agent asked, crossing her legs. We could set up a small press conference or a meeting with that airline's CEO. Or we could direct them to an advocacy group so they can partner and handle it. You're obviously busy with your film commitments, But there's an opportunity here to create real change. Chris drew a slow breath. He was an actor, not a policymaker or an activist by trade, but his platform gave him certain power. If it can help, I'm willing to do a press statement or meet with the airline, he said at last. But I don't want this to be about me or my image. The real issue is that people deserve the right to travel with legitimate service animals, especially for psychiatric conditions. Let's see if we can connect them with the right advocacy group to shape the conversation. His agent nodded with an approving smile, and they spent the next hour mapping out a plan. They reached out to Kyle to see if he was comfortable continuing to share his story, ensuring that the focus stayed on the real problem rather than sensationalizing the incident. Meanwhile, Chris would release a statement endorsing improvements in staff training and encouraging airlines to align with best practices under the Americans with Disabilities Act. They would emphasize the fact that this was about every traveler who'd been similarly mistreated, not just one individual. Back in Detroit, a storm was brewing for the local airport management. As more details emerged, some employees anonymously shared stories of the supervisor's unprofessional conduct. Complaints about her had apparently stacked up for months. She was known to ridicule passengers with hidden disabilities, including deaf travelers who needed interpreters, and older passengers with advanced arthritis who requested pre-boarding. A local watchdog journalist uncovered at least 4 pending complaints from separate incidents. These revelations fueled further outrage. Advocacy groups ramped up the pressure, threatening to file formal complaints with the Department of Transportation. The airline's PR department scrambled. Fearful of reputational damage, the airline put out multiple statements, eventually suspending the supervisor pending an internal investigation. They invited disability advocates to review their training modules. After a few more days of intense public scrutiny, the airline's CEO announced a series of internal reforms, including a pilot program to better educate staff on the distinction between service animals, emotional support animals, and pets. They also pledged to train employees on how to interact with travelers who have mental health conditions. National news programs picked up the story again, praising the shift toward better training. A few cynics dismissed it as mere damage control. Nonetheless, it was a step in the right direction. At the center of it all, an ordinary young man, Kyle, found himself invited to speak at a local disability rights panel. Nervous about public speaking, he considered turning it down. But after talking with his therapist and receiving supportive messages from people around the world, he decided to accept. On stage at a small auditorium in Detroit, he stood with Samson by his side and shared how humiliating it was to be questioned and doubted for a condition that didn't show on the outside. He spoke softly, but passionately, about the real difference between a trained service dog and a pet, how critical the dog's role was in crisis situations, and how institutions needed to show compassion first, not skepticism. The panel was live-streamed, and thousands of viewers tuned in. Chris Hemsworth, sitting in his trailer in California between takes on his new movie, clicked on the link to watch. He was moved by Kyle's courage. The man's voice still held traces of anxiety, but also a newfound confidence. He was turning a painful experience into a platform for awareness. And Chris couldn't have been prouder, not just of Kyle, but of the everyday folks who had come forward with their own stories of traveling with service animals and encountering barriers. A month after the incident, the airline officially announced an overhaul to its training procedures. Videos from real-life travelers with disabilities were integrated into their educational materials for staff. Sensitivity training became mandatory, focusing on the importance of not dismissing claims of hidden disabilities. The airport authority also introduced a new passenger advocate system at Detroit Metropolitan, ensuring that any disputes over service, animal documentation would be handled by a designated liaison with specialized training. In a quiet press briefing at the airport, the new policy was unveiled. Media outlets turned out, including local news and some national networks that had followed the story. The airline's representative, standing at a podium set up in a bright corner of the concourse, spoke about the need for empathy and the importance of ensuring that employees did not abuse their authority. The city's mayor also made brief remarks about Detroit striving to become a model for accessible air travel. Kyle was there, alongside representatives from a major disability rights organization. Samson sat calmly by his side, scanning the crowd with curious eyes. The dog's bright vest was freshly cleaned, and around his collar hung a special tag the organization had given him as a symbol of recognition for the awareness he helped bring about. A hush fell when Kyle stepped up to the microphone. He recounted the story, how humiliating it had been, how close he was to suffering a severe panic attack that day, and how a single moment of compassion from a bystander, who happened to be a famous actor, turned the tide. He concluded with these words, "I'm grateful for the changes happening here, but I want everyone to remember it shouldn't take a celebrity or a viral video to uphold basic rights. People with invisible disabilities deserve to be treated respect all times, by all staff, in all places." In applause filled the concourse. Reporters angled their cameras. Samson wagged his tail. Behind the scenes, a staffer pressed a small button, turning on a new screen that ran a short training video about how to correctly interact with service dog teams. For those who had followed the story from the beginning, it felt like a moment of triumph, and also a promise that more work lay ahead. This was just one airport, one airline, but it was a start. Watching coverage of the event from a laptop in his Los Angeles home, Chris found himself smiling. He had chosen not to attend the press conference in person, wanting to keep the spotlight on the real issues and the people directly affected. But the images of the reformed policies, the new training modules, and Kyle speaking up filled him with hope. The system hadn't been perfect, but it was changing. Slowly, painfully, but tangibly changing. His phone buzzed, a text from his agent. "We just got a statement from the airline. They're grateful for your role in raising awareness. They'd like to send you a letter of appreciation." Chris chuckled. He didn't need their thanks. He just wanted people like Kyle to travel without fear of harassment or discrimination. He typed back a polite acknowledgement. Later that evening, he posted a final social media update about the incident. He congratulated Kyle for his advocacy, thanked the many people who had spoken out, and expressed optimism that these reforms would help others. Responses poured in by the thousands, from individuals with service animals, from mental health advocates, from fans who simply said how proud they were. And though the internet's fervor would inevitably move on to some new headline, Chris sensed that a lasting shift had been made. The next time a passenger with a service dog in Detroit stepped up to a gate, the staff would look at them with more open minds. And that was worth everything. A few weeks later, on a calm morning in Los Angeles, Chris strolled out of his home to pick up the newspaper. The sun was shining brilliantly, the sky a crisp blue that reminded him how different it was from the steel, gray overcast of that day in Detroit. A slight breeze ruffled the leaves of the palm trees in his yard. He thumbed through the news, half expecting the story to have disappeared from the national conversation by now, but a small article in the lifestyle section caught his eye. Detroit Metro rolls out new service dog policy, a model for accessibility. It was a short piece, quoting an advocacy group praising the changes. They credited the viral video for triggering it. The article ended with a line about how a man named Kyle Andrews was adjusting well to being the accidental face of this movement, though he looked forward to a day when flying felt normal instead of confrontational. Reading that, Chris felt both satisfaction and humility. All it took was a moment of decency. Stepping in, using his voice, refusing to watch someone be mistreated. How many times, in how many airports and offices and stores, had people with disabilities faced that same discrimination? This was a drop in the ocean, but at least it was some measure of progress. He carried the paper inside, set it on the counter, and decided to call his mother back in Australia. He wanted to share the good news, to tell her about how one small stand had ignited significant change. He knew she'd be proud. And as the day wore on, the story continued to ripple. The seeds of transformation planted in that single confrontation in Detroit took root, spreading to other airports and other institutions. Online forums buzzed with new accounts of staff being more receptive, more thorough, less condescending when passengers presented service dog credentials. Stories trickled in of travelers saying, "You won't believe it. Nobody questioned me this time. They actually thanked me for having my dog's documents in order." Kyle found a sense of empowerment he'd never had before. He'd always felt overshadowed by his anxiety, tethered to the fear that it would flare up at the worst time. But after everything he'd gone through, he realized that the dog was not just an emotional bolster, but also a symbol of how he could confront adversity and come out stronger. He started volunteering at a local training center for service dogs, telling new handlers about the differences they could make in society simply by living openly and proudly. Chris, for his part, returned to the demands of his acting schedule. But every so often, he'd get a message, an email or a social media post from a stranger in some corner of the country, thanking him for standing up for them. A mother whose son had a service dog for autism wrote that, because of the Detroit incident, she was better prepared to assert her rights on a recent flight. A veteran with PTSD who used a service dog reported that for the first time, staff had greeted him with a respectful nod and instantly honored his need to keep the dog at his side. Each story was a powerful reminder that small acts of solidarity could reshape how institutions treated the vulnerable. Looking back, Chris would always remember that tense circle of onlookers at Gate C30, the humiliating confrontation, and the relief when a manager stepped in to do the right thing. He'd remember how the golden retriever nudged Kyle's hand in the middle of the chaos, offering silent comfort. He'd recall the applause from bystanders who recognized an injustice undone. Mostly, he'd hold on to the notion that standing up for someone else's dignity was never wasted effort, even if it meant stepping outside one's comfort zone. Sometimes, that was precisely what was needed to spark a broader movement. If you've ever witnessed someone being treated unjustly, ask yourself how you might respond. Could you be the single voice that tips the scales toward fairness? Could a moment of bravery, large or small, motivate a crowd to follow suit? The next time you see a person with a service animal, physical or psychiatric, will you honor the role that dog plays in protecting a fragile sense of normalcy? Every day, these questions arise in unsuspecting places, from airports to grocery stores to restaurants, each scenario an invitation to act with empathy. The new policies continued to evolve. Within 6 months, Detroit Metropolitan Airport officially announced that all front-facing staff underwent special training modules that included real testimonials from travelers like Kyle. Word trickled out that the suspended supervisor had resigned before the investigation concluded. There was talk of her appealing the decision, but public sentiment, and her own track record, didn't leave much room for sympathy. Meanwhile, at the corporate level, the airline's legal department collaborated with national disability advocacy organizations to refine guidelines to better differentiate legitimate service animals from untrained pets. It was a complex process, but it demonstrated at least some genuine desire to avoid repeats of the fiasco that had captured the world's attention. For Kyle, the journey wasn't over. Anxiety didn't magically disappear just because he had become a spokesperson of sorts. There were still long nights when the panic crept up on him. Samson would sense his distress, climb onto the bed, and lie beside him until the worst passed. Yet Kyle felt stronger. He traveled again, armed with new confidence and the knowledge that thousands of people supported his right to exist in public spaces without being shamed for an invisible condition. Months turned into a year. The Detroit incident gradually shifted from hot news to a case study in corporate responsibility and disability rights. People analyzing the saga realized that it had all hinged on a confluence of factors: the presence of a bystander, Chris Hemsworth, willing to speak up, the existence of a crowd that had documented the situation with phone cameras, the airline manager who confirmed that everything was in order, and the unstoppable momentum of social media. Without any one of those elements, the story might have ended differently. Yet, though the media wave subsided, the changes remained. Detroit Metropolitan Airport was widely recognized for setting a new standard, and travelers who used service animals posted positive reports, praising staff for their courtesy and knowledge. The impetus for that shift began with an act of discrimination, reversed by empathy. Every so often, people still asked Chris about it during interviews. "What made you step in? Did you think it would become so big?" He always gave a variation of the same answer. "It just seemed like the right thing to do. I couldn't watch and do nothing." Ultimately, that was the core of the story, a decision to take action in a moment of crisis. One man's courage, grounded in empathy, rippled out to spur systemic reforms. That day in the overcast airport wasn't planned. It was a collision of personalities, policies, and deeply human vulnerabilities. Out of that messy encounter, hope emerged, showing that even large institutions could change if enough people shone a light on their failings. Have you ever been in a situation where someone needed your support? Would you speak up, even if you felt uncertain of how others might react? Sometimes, all it takes is a single voice to rally a crowd, a single gesture of compassion to melt institutional barriers. This story, born of tension and confrontation, stands as a reminder that each of us has a role to play in recognizing injustice and choosing to act. And now, as Kyle continues his life, traveling to see his family in times of need without fear, and as new staff at that very airport attend mandatory seminars about the importance of treating passengers with empathy, the ripple effect continues. There is a renewed sense of accountability among the ranks. Security officers, supervisors, gate agents, who realize they are not just enforcers of rules, but also guardians of each traveler's dignity. Chris Hemsworth goes about his life, filming and speaking about new projects, but he carries that memory like a quiet ember of resolve. Never underestimate the power of doing the right thing in the moment. New powerful story drops every evening starting tomorrow. Hit subscribe.